I was sipping coffee on my porch the morning I saw the bulldozer rolling down our street like it was headed for Normandy. The sun wasn't even high yet, and here comes this massive yellow machine crawling along the cul-de-sac, followed by 2 HOA board members in khakis like they were generals leading an armored division. For a second, I honestly thought I was still dreaming. Then I saw where they were headed, straight for the strip of gravel that marks my driveway before it curves down toward the lake. My lake. The absurdity nearly made me spit out my coffee. A bulldozer on our quiet little lakeside road? This wasn't construction season. Nobody had filed permits for shoreline work. It clicked in about 3 heartbeats. The HOA had finally decided to make good on their ridiculous dock scheme. For months, they'd been yapping about community access, pretending the lake was public when every plot map in the county recorder's office said otherwise. They wanted a boat launch, fishing access, jet ski parking, all of it built right on my shoreline. And apparently, they thought they'd just bulldoze their way through my property before breakfast. I set my mug down, walked to the end of the porch, and waved like I was greeting neighbors. One of the board members, Janet, the president, a woman with a permanent pinched expression like she's perpetually sniffing spoiled milk, pointed toward me and shouted over the diesel roar. "We're moving forward today." The dock committee approved it unanimously. The driver revved the bulldozer as if that declaration was a legal permit. "Funny," I called back, "because last I checked, the dock committee doesn't own my lakefront." Janet's sidekick, a balding man named Carl whose entire personality was HOA bylaws, waved a stack of papers like holy scripture. "We have authorization," he hollered. "Authorization to trespass?" I asked, strolling down the drive. My tone was calm, conversational even, but inside I could feel that cold coil of disbelief tightening. They weren't bluffing. They were about to carve up my shoreline with heavy machinery. The bulldozer lurched forward. Gravel crunched under its tracks. My driveway shuddered like it was bracing for war. "Stop the machine," I said flatly. "Now." The driver, a contractor who looked confused about what circus he'd joined, glanced between me and Janet. She jabbed her finger toward the lake. "Keep going. Don't let him intimidate you." That was the hook for the crowd. Neighbors began appearing on porches and lawns, pajama-clad spectators clutching mugs and phones. Everyone knew the HOA loved flexing power, but seeing a bulldozer aimed at my property before 9 a.m. was better entertainment than cable. I planted myself in the middle of the driveway. No yelling, no dramatic gestures. Just calm stillness. The machine's bucket was maybe 20 feet from me, caked in old dirt like the jaw of some prehistoric beast. "If that thing moves another inch," I said loud enough for the gathering audience, "you'll be explaining to the sheriff why you drove heavy equipment onto private land without a permit." Carl stepped forward, sweat shining on his forehead. "We don't need a permit. It's community property by precedent." Precedent. I nearly laughed. The only precedent was them pushing boundaries, and me pushing back harder. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, lowering my voice so only the driver could hear. "You cut that engine, turn around, and no one has to write your company a check for damages. Or, you keep driving, and you get to explain to your boss why the sheriff impounded his bulldozer from my mud." The driver froze, knuckles tightening on the controls. He glanced at Janet, then at me, then at the growing ring of neighbors recording on their phones. For a long moment, the whole world seemed to hum with the engine's vibration. Then, with a cough of exhaust, he killed the motor. Janet spun on him like he'd just betrayed Caesar. "What are you doing?" "We had approval." The driver wiped sweat from his brow. "Lady, I was told to clear a path for a dock, not start a civil war." The crowd actually laughed. The tension cracked like ice, and for the first time, Janet looked rattled. But here's the thing about people like her: they never see themselves as wrong. They only see themselves as temporarily inconvenienced. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "This isn't over. The HOA will not be bullied by one stubborn homeowner." I smiled. "Funny, That's exactly what I was going to say to you. The bulldozer backed out of my driveway under a chorus of chuckles from the neighbors. Phones were already buzzing with texts and photos. By the time I walked back to my porch, the story of Janet's failed invasion was halfway across the subdivision. Later that day, an official-looking letter appeared in my mailbox. It accused me of obstructing community development and warned that the HOA would pursue all avenues to enforce access rights. It was signed by Janet herself, in handwriting so aggressive the pen must have nearly torn through the page. I poured another coffee, sat on the porch, and reread the letter until the edges curled in my hand. They had escalated. They'd made their first real move, with heavy machinery no less. The next step, I knew, wouldn't be subtle. The lake glittered below, calm and oblivious. To anyone else, it was a picturesque view. To me, it was a chessboard. The HOA thought they were advancing a rook. What they didn't realize was that I'd been planning for their next 10 moves since the first time Janet mentioned community dock access, at a meeting 2 years ago. That night, the contractor called me. Apparently, Janet had refused to pay him for the wasted morning, claiming he'd breached agreement. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify if things went legal. I told him yes, of course. Then I asked him, just out of curiosity, what weight limit that bulldozer could handle. He gave me the numbers. I made a note. The following week, I spotted Carl and Janet standing by the lake, measuring tapes dangling, gesturing furiously at the waterline. They were whispering like conspirators, heads bent together. I stayed out of sight, listening from behind a line of birch trees. Next time, Carl said, we bring it closer to the shoreline. He can't block us forever. Janet nodded, her jaw tight. If we show the county it's already underway, they'll have to let us finish. Momentum is everything. It was absurd, almost comical. They actually thought half burying a dock in mud would force the government to side with them. But absurd plans have a way of gaining traction when backed by stubborn pride. And that's when it hit me, the inevitability of what was coming. The HOA was going to bring that bulldozer back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week. But they'd try again. And when they did, the lake itself would be my ally. Because underneath the calm glitter of that water was a stretch of shoreline so soft, so treacherously silty, that even deer avoided it. I'd nearly lost a tractor tire in it once. The bulldozer wouldn't stand a chance. The board thought they were the only ones willing to escalate. They thought intimidation and paperwork gave them the upper hand. They had no idea the lake was already sharpening its teeth. And I was more than willing to let them walk straight into its jaws. I didn't have to wait long for the sequel to the bulldozer standoff. The HOA moved faster than I expected, like a wounded animal lashing out before it had even stopped bleeding. 2 days after the failed invasion, an envelope thicker than a church hymnal landed in my mailbox. Inside, a cease and desist letter drafted by some HOA lawyer whose hourly rate probably cost more than my truck payment. It accused me of willful obstruction of community improvements, denial of rightful shared access, and, my favorite, hostile intimidation of contracted workers. I almost laughed myself off the porch swing reading that line. Hostile intimidation? I had literally stood still and talked calmly while a bulldozer was pointed at me. Apparently, in HOA land, refusing to get flattened was an act of aggression. But tucked inside the letter was the real gem, a notice of intent to begin construction the following Saturday. No signatures from the county. No permits. Just a bold proclamation that the community dock will proceed as planned. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it back in the envelope, and set it on the kitchen counter. That's when the anticipation hit me. The strange cocktail of dread and excitement that comes when you know the storm is inevitable, but you've already got the high ground. The week crawled by. Every morning, I'd spot Janet and Carl prowling the shoreline, sometimes with clipboards, sometimes with men I didn't recognize. Surveyors, contractors, hangers-on. Each time, I'd linger out of sight, taking quiet note of where they stood. They always gathered on the softest stretch of earth. That was no accident. They were drawn to the flattest piece of shoreline, perfect for a dock in theory, disastrous in practice. By Friday evening, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. You could hear it in the way people spoke in the grocery store parking lot, in the chuckles exchanged at the gas station. The HOA's going for round 2. Phones were ready. Everyone wanted front row seats to the sequel. Saturday dawned humid, the kind of day where the air itself feels restless. I woke before sunrise, brewed strong coffee, and positioned myself on the porch like a general waiting for enemy banners on the horizon. Sure enough, at 8 sharp, I heard the low growl of machinery. This time, they hadn't brought one bulldozer. They'd brought 2. Twin machines crawled down the road, diesel fumes curling behind them, and a caravan of cars followed. HOA members, contractors, and, inevitably, the neighborhood peanut gallery. Janet strode at the front of the procession like Napoleon at Waterloo, chin high, eyes fixed on the lake. I didn't move. Not yet. Timing was everything. The bulldozers rumbled down my driveway, past the spot where the first had stopped days earlier. The drivers looked wary, but Janet barked orders like a field commander. Straight to the shoreline. We'll establish the foundation today. The crowd pressed closer. Phones rose like periscope. When the machines hit the edge of the silta bank, I stood. Calm as ever. You're trespassing, I said. Janet spun, fury painted across her face. You can't stop progress with idle threats. I held up a piece of paper. The county assessor's map of property lines, with my parcel outlined in bold ink. This says otherwise. She didn't even look. We've consulted with legal. The lakefront is for community use. Step aside. I didn't move. Instead, I let silence hang until the first bulldozer rolled onto the soft earth. At first, it was steady. The massive machine lumbered forward, bucket raised like a lance. But then, with a sound like a giant straw sucking mud, one track sank. The driver throttled forward, trying to compensate. The track dug deeper. The machine tilted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The second bulldozer hesitated. Its driver shot a nervous glance at me, then at the sinking machine. Janet clapped her hands furiously. Keep going. It's just surface mud. Push through. The driver obeyed. He eased forward, bucket lowered, trying to widen the path. For about 3 seconds it worked. Then the earth gave way beneath him like a trapdoor. The second bulldozer sank half a foot in one lurch, mud swallowing its tracks with greedy gurgles. Now the first machine was tilting dangerously, its nose pointed at the lake, rear lifted just enough to send a shiver down my spine. The driver cursed, slamming controls, but the machine only slid deeper. Mud lapped at its tracks like waves. The crowd erupted, some with laughter, some with panic. Phones filmed every second. Carl barked instructions no one followed. Janet screamed at the drivers to push harder, her voice cracking into shrill desperation. I stepped closer, hands in my pockets, perfectly calm. Told you the lake doesn't share well. The first bulldozer gave a final groan and listed forward, its bucket plunging into the water with a splash that drenched Janet from head to toe. The crowd roared with laughter. She stood dripping, hair plastered, blouse clinging, the very image of a general drowned by her own charge. The second machine, now trapped axle deep, sputtered as its driver killed the engine in surrender. Both machines sat like beached whales, half swallowed by mud and water. Janet whirled on me, eyes blazing. You sabotaged this. I raised an eyebrow. Sabotaged the laws of physics? You'll have to take that up with gravity. The crowd laughed again, some openly, some behind hands. The drivers climbed out, mud caked up to their knees, shaking their heads. One muttered, "Should have never taken this job." Carl tried to salvage dignity, shouting about temporary setbacks and exaggerated conditions, but no one was listening. The spectacle was too rich. By noon, tow trucks had arrived, their drivers gawking at the sight of 2 bulldozers sunk like toys in a sandbox. The extraction process was slow, humiliating, and loud. Chains snapped, engines strained, mud sucked greedily, refusing to release its prizes. The crowd stayed until the machines were finally dragged free, leaving behind gouges in the shoreline and a crater filled with brown water. When it was over, Janet stood trembling, covered in mud, reputation in tatters. She hissed at me as she passed. "You think this is funny? You'll regret it." I smiled faintly. "I already don't regret it." That night, the neighborhood was electric. Videos spread like wildfire. On text chains, on Facebook groups, even whispered about at the diner downtown. HOA sinks bulldozers in illegal dock attempt. The footage was damning. 2 machines, one nearly swallowed, Janet flailing in mud. But victory never comes without consequence. The next morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. This one colder, shorter, and far more dangerous. It announced that the HOA would be pursuing legal action for obstruction of community development and deliberate interference with contracted equipment. They wanted damages. The laugh caught in my throat. They wanted me to pay for the bulldozers they'd sunk on my land. That's when I realized. Janet and Carl weren't embarrassed by their disaster. They were enraged. And rage makes people dangerous. I leaned back in my porch chair, letter dangling between my fingers, watching the lake sparkle like nothing had happened. But I knew. This was only the second move in a long game. And the HOA had just convinced themselves they were the underdogs. Underdogs with vendettas tend to bite harder. I sipped my coffee and let the silence stretch. If they wanted escalation, they'd get it. But the lake wasn't done with them yet. Not by a long shot. The letter from the HOA's lawyer sat on my kitchen table like a coiled snake. I must have read it 5 times, each pass more absurd than the last. According to their brilliant legal mind, I owed damages for negligent interference with contracted machinery and delaying the construction of essential community assets. Essential asset. That's what they were calling a vanity dock nobody but Janet and Carl wanted. I called the number listed on the bottom of the letter. A paralegal answered. I explained calmly that the bulldozers had trespassed onto private property without permits, that they'd sunk because of their own reckless misuse, and that I had half the neighborhood as witnesses plus hours of video evidence. Silence hummed on the other end. Then the paralegal muttered, "I'll relay this to counsel," and hung up. It was tempting to believe that was the end of it. But the next morning, a deputy sheriff's cruiser rolled into my drive. Out stepped a deputy I knew casually, Dan, a man with a thick mustache and a sense of humor dry as kindling. He held a manila envelope and looked apologetic before he even spoke. "Got papers for you," he said, handing me the envelope. Inside, a formal notice of pending civil suit. The HOA had officially filed. I scanned the pages. They wanted tens of thousands in damages. Compensation for lost work hours, equipment cleaning and repair, and diminished reputation. That last one nearly made me laugh out loud. Their reputation had drowned itself, and they wanted me to pay for the funeral. Dan scratched his jaw. Between us, half the department's seen those videos. This is gonna look ridiculous in court. Yeah, I said. But they're counting on making it expensive, not reasonable. And that was the real weapon. Not bulldozers, not bylaws, lawyers. They figured I'd fold when faced with mounting legal bills. That's the HOA playbook. Grind you down with fees until you're too exhausted or broke to fight. But I don't fold. I spent the next week gathering my own arsenal. First, documentation. Property maps, deeds, county records, photos of the shoreline before and after the incident. Then, witnesses. Half a dozen neighbors happy to testify, plus the bulldozer drivers themselves, both still furious over not being paid. One even texted me, "Call me anytime, I'll bury them in court." The videos were the crown jewel. Dozens of angles, all showing the HOA directing bulldozers straight onto my land. Some even caught Janet shrieking, "Push through!" right before the mud swallowed the machines. It was cinematic evidence. But the real checkmate came when I filed my own counterclaim. trespass, property damage, and unlawful attempt at construction without permit. Suddenly, the battlefield was even. They'd wanted me on the defensive. Instead, they were staring down the barrel of my offense. Janet reacted exactly as I expected. She doubled down. Flyers appeared in mailboxes across the subdivision, each one a manifesto of half-truths and outrage. According to her pamphlet, I was selfishly denying access to shared natural resources, endangering community cohesion, and, my favorite, hoarding shoreline for personal gain. The neighborhood response was lukewarm at best. Sure, a handful of HOA loyalists parroted her rhetoric, but most people just laughed. They'd seen the bulldozers sink. They'd seen Janet flailing in the mud. Her authority was cracking like thin ice. Still, I stayed cautious. People backed into corners often swing wild. And Janet's corner was getting smaller by the day. 2 weeks later, the first hearing arrived. The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor polish, the kind of place where petty conflicts get inflated into dramatic showdowns. Janet sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored blazer 2 sizes too sharp, chin jutting like she was about to cross-examine history itself. Carl sat beside her, shuffling papers nervously. Their lawyer, a thin man with glasses that made him look perpetually unimpressed, adjusted his tie. I took my place at the defendant's table with my attorney, a local man named Harris. He was calm, methodical, and exactly the opposite of flashy. The kind of lawyer who dismantled cases one quiet fact at a time. The judge entered, a woman known for her intolerance of nonsense. Perfect. The HOA's lawyer launched first, spinning a tale of malicious obstruction, reckless endangerment, and community suffering. His voice rose with each sentence until he was practically sermonizing. Janet nodded along furiously, shooting glances at the judge as if expecting applause. Then Harris stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the evidence. The property deed, the permit requirements, the trespassing bulldozers. And then, like a dagger wrapped in velvet, he played the videos. The courtroom erupted with muffled laughter as the bulldozer slid into the lake. The sound of Janet shrieking "push through" echoed against the walls. Even the judge cracked a smile before she coughed and composed herself. By the time Harris finished, the case against me looked like what it was, a tantrum dressed in legal jargon. The judge dismissed most of the HOA's claims outright. You cannot demand damages for consequences of your own unauthorized actions, she said sharply. She scheduled a later hearing for my counterclaim. Janet's face was crimson. Carl looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Their lawyer gathered his papers without making eye contact. Outside the courthouse, neighbors who'd come to watch clapped me on the back. You gutted them, one whispered. Another laughed, best entertainment I've had all year. But victory has shadows. The next morning, I found something new, a bright orange notice staked into the ground near my mailbox. It was an HOA citation accusing me of landscape violations and failure to maintain aesthetic standards. According to their nonsense, my driveway gravel was uneven, my fence was weathered, and even my porch furniture was inconsistent with neighborhood harmony. It was petty, desperate, and transparent. They couldn't beat me in court, so they'd weaponize their little rulebook instead. I pulled the stake out of the ground and tossed it in the trash. But I knew more would come. Fines, inspections, letters, death by paperwork. Janet was out for revenge now, not justice. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, I sat on the porch and considered my next move. Retaliation wasn't my style. I preferred strategy, patience. They wanted to bury me under petty rules? Fine. I'd let them dig the hole themselves. Because while Janet was busy scribbling citations, she hadn't noticed the tide turning. More neighbors were openly mocking the HOA. The videos had embarrassed them beyond repair. And whispers were starting, whispers about removing Janet as president. The irony was almost too rich. She'd wanted a dock to solidify her power. Instead, she'd sunk her authority along with the bulldozers. And the best part? The lake wasn't done yet. I had a plan forming, one that didn't involve lawyers or shouting matches. A plan that would make their entire dock scheme collapse under its own weight, once and for all. For now, though, I leaned back, watched the water shimmer, and let the quiet laughter of crickets fill the air. The HOA thought the courtroom was the climax. They hadn't realized it was just the intermission. The citations arrived like clockwork. Every 3 or 4 days, I'd find a fresh orange slip nailed to my fence or stuffed in my mailbox. The complaints were laughable. Driveway gravel does not conform to aesthetic uniformity, mailbox paint insufficiently glossy, improper placement of trash cans visible from street. Each one carried a fine, $50 here, $100 there. Janet was weaponizing the rulebook like a blunt instrument. At first, I ignored them. Then I filed formal appeals, each one neatly documented and stamped. That bought time. But the real point of the campaign wasn't the money. It was psychological warfare. Janet wanted me buried in paperwork, harassed into exhaustion, isolated from neighbors who might grow tired of the spectacle. Except the opposite happened. The more absurd the citations became, the more the neighborhood noticed. Videos still circulated of the bulldozer fiasco, and now screenshots of my violations were popping up in group chats. Someone even made a meme of my supposedly non-uniform gravel, labeling it the real threat to community safety. It spread faster than the HOA could tear down the copies taped to stop signs. But not everyone was amused. A small faction of loyalists rallied around Janet, convinced she was defending the community from my arrogance. They parroted her flyers, whispered at HOA meetings, and started side-eyeing me when I drove by. The subdivision was splitting like a log under too much pressure. The tension came to a head at the monthly HOA meeting. Normally, those gatherings were dull affairs: budget reports, landscaping updates, endless debates about seasonal decorations. This one felt more like a trial. The room buzzed when I walked in. Half the chairs swiveled toward me, some smiling, some scowling. Janet sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, Carl at her elbow. Her expression was pure satisfaction. "We are here," she announced grandly, "to address ongoing violations that threaten the harmony of our community." She listed my supposed crimes one by one, slamming the gavel after each as if she were sentencing a criminal. Gravel, trash cans, fence, porch furniture. She even accused me of harboring unsightly weeds in a patch of wildflowers near my mailbox. I let her talk, let her savor the theatric. Then, when she finally demanded my response, I stood calmly. "Everything you've listed has already been appealed. And by law, you can't collect fines until those appeals are resolved. Which means," I let my eyes sweep the room, "this entire charade is nothing more than harassment." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Janet's gavel cracked against the table. "Order," she barked. I turned to the crowd. "Tell me honestly, are these the battles you want fought? Are these the things that keep you awake at night? Gravel and porch chairs." That cracked the tension. A few chuckles broke free, then spread. Even some of Janet's loyalists shifted uncomfortably. Carl jumped up, red-faced. "This isn't a joke. Rules are rules." "Then apply them fairly," I shot back. "If you're citing me for gravel, why not cite the 10 other driveways that don't match? If you're citing me for trash cans, why not the ones left out for days at the end of the street? If you're citing me for weeds, why not half the yards in this subdivision? Unless," I paused, letting the silence sharpen, "it's not about rules at all. Unless it's about punishment." The room erupted. Voices overlapped, neighbors arguing with each other, some demanding fairness, others defending the board. Janet banged the gavel until her hand shook. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. But the damage was done. The fracture lines were visible now, jagged and raw. The next week was chaos. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me stopped by to drop off casseroles or offer quiet support. Others avoided eye contact altogether. One man even shouted "rule breaker" when I walked past his driveway. It felt like living in a Cold War, half the neighborhood siding with reason, the other half brainwashed by Janet's crusade. Then the vandalism started. It began with petty things. Trash cans mysteriously overturned, my mailbox bashed in one night. Then someone spray-painted "Hoarder" across my fence in sloppy letters. I reported it all to the sheriff's office, but Dan admitted they couldn't prove anything. "No cameras, no witnesses," he said with a sigh. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of decay. Instead, Janet's obsession had poisoned the whole neighborhood. But amid the harassment, a strange opportunity emerged. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a beer, a neighbor approached, a man named David who lived 3 houses down. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Look," he said, voice low. "I'm on the board. I can't say this publicly, but a lot of us are sick of Janet. She's burning the place down just to get at you." "Then vote her out," I said simply. He shook his head. "She's got Carl and 2 others locked in. But if we can flip one more, the majority shift, we can strip her authority." That caught my attention. For months, I'd been reacting to Janet's moves, blocking her attacks. Now there was a chance to flip the board itself. "Who's the swing?" I asked. David hesitated. "A woman named Linda. She hates the fighting, but Janet's convinced her you're the problem. If she changes her mind, it's over." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe Linda just needs to see the truth." The plan formed like mist in the dark. I didn't need to convince Linda with arguments. I needed her to see the reality Janet was hiding. The citations, the harassment, the vandalism, all documented, all undeniable. Over the next week, I assembled a dossier. Photos of vandalism, copies of citations, screenshots of texts from neighbors showing support, and the piece de resistance, a compilation of every video from the bulldozer fiasco, edited clean and sharp, showing Janet barking orders as the machines sank. I didn't confront Linda. I didn't campaign or corner her. Instead, I left the package on her porch one evening with a note: "Make up your own mind." Days passed in silence. Then, at the next board meeting, Linda spoke. She interrupted Janet mid-rant, voice shaking but clear. "I've reviewed the evidence. I believe we've been misled. This campaign against him is personal, not about community. I can't support it anymore." Gasps filled the room. Janet went pale. Carl stammered. And just like that, the majority shifted. The board voted to suspend all pending citations until further review. It wasn't a full dethroning, but it was a dagger to Janet's power. She tried to mask her fury, smiling stiffly as the vote concluded. But her eyes told the truth. I'd cornered her, and she wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. As the meeting ended, she leaned close, her whisper icy. "You think this ends with a vote? You have no idea how far I'm willing to go." I believed her, and as I drove home, headlights sweeping across the fractured neighborhood, I knew the next move wouldn't be legal or procedural. Janet was too far gone for that. The bulldozers had sunk, the lawsuits had faltered, the board had slipped through her fingers. What she had left was desperation. And desperation is the most dangerous weapon of all. The first sign of sabotage came quietly, almost subtle enough to dismiss. One morning, I walked down to the lake and found my canoe half sunk at the dock, a fresh gash along its side. At first, I thought it was an accident, maybe a branch or a careless kid. But when I hauled it out, the cut was clean, deliberate, the kind of damage that required a blade. That night, my porch lights flickered off. When I checked the breaker, the wires feeding the outdoor line had been sliced. Not chewed by animals, cut. By the third incident, sugar poured into my truck's gas tank. I stopped pretending. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted sabotage. The sheriff came out, of course. Dan took the report with that same weary look. "You know I can't put anything on her without proof," he said. "But, between us, I'd keep a camera rolling." So I did. I installed motion lights, cameras along the driveway, and a trail cam hidden near the shoreline. If Janet wanted to escalate, I'd let her hang herself with her own rope. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was unraveling. The fracture lines from the HOA meeting had split into open hostility. One faction mocked Janet's every move, while the loyalists doubled down. Yard signs sprouted overnight, one side plastered with "Protect our lake access," the other countering with "No bulldozers on our shore." It looked like a political campaign had exploded in suburbia. The tension boiled over one Saturday afternoon. I was stacking firewood when raised voices drifted from the cul-de-sac. By the time I walked down, two groups of neighbors were squared off in the street, shouting, "You're letting him hoard the lake," one woman screamed, pointing toward me. "He owns it," another neighbor shot back. "Do you people not understand property lines?" Carl was in the thick of it, waving HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments. "The lake is for everyone. If we don't fight now, he'll wall it off forever." I raised my voice just enough to cut through the noise. "I haven't walled off anything. I've stopped illegal construction." "There's a difference." That only added fuel. Fingers jabbed, insults flew. It took a deputy's cruiser pulling in to scatter the crowd before fists landed. The subdivision had become a battlefield, and Janet was the general feeding her troops a steady diet of fear and entitlement. But she wasn't content with chaos. She wanted blood. One night, close to midnight, I heard the rumble of an engine near the shoreline. Quiet, low, deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and moved silently through the trees. When I reached the edge, the beam cut across a shadowy figure crouched near the waterline, wrench in hand, working at the bolts of my small dock. Janet. Her hair was tied back, face set in grim focus. She was loosening the dock's supports, trying to sabotage it so it would drift away or collapse. "Funny time for home improvement," I said, voice calm but loud enough to make her freeze. She spun, eyes wide in the glare of my flashlight. For a moment, she looked almost feral, caught in pure instinct. Then she straightened, trying to reclaim authority. "This dock is an eyesore. I'm restoring community standards." "On private property?" I asked. "At midnight?" With a wrench. Her jaw clenched. "You've poisoned this neighborhood. You think everyone's laughing at me, but they're laughing at you. They see you for what you are, a selfish man hiding behind deeds and permits." I lowered the flashlight slightly, studying her. "If you believe that, why sneak around at night instead of holding another meeting?" The silence stretched. For the first time, I saw the desperation crack through her armor. She wasn't here to enforce rules. She was here because she was losing. Before she could answer, the motion lights I'd installed flicked on, bathing us both in harsh white. A chorus of dogs barked across the street. Curtains shifted in nearby houses. Janet hissed like a cornered cat, dropped the wrench, and bolted into the trees. I picked up the tool and shook my head. She was unraveling fast, and everyone was starting to see it. The next morning, I didn't have to tell anyone what happened. Word spread like fire. By noon, neighbors were whispering about how Janet had been caught breaking into docks. Some said she was seen running through backyards, mud streaked up her legs. Her loyalists tried to spin it, claiming I'd staged the whole thing. But the cracks were widening. Linda, the swing vote on the board, called me privately. "She's gone too far," she whispered. "I think we have the numbers to remove her." The plan was simple. Call an emergency meeting, vote her out, replace her with someone stable. But nothing with Janet was ever simple. When the meeting convened in the clubhouse, the room was overflowing. Neighbors packed every chair, stood against the walls, even spilled out into the hallway. The air was electric, buzzing with anticipation. David, the board member who'd first approached me, stood and called the vote. Motion to remove Janet as president of the HOA. The roar of voices was immediate, some cheering, some shouting in protest. Janet slammed her palm on the table. "This is illegal. You can't do this without proper notice." "It's in the bylaws," David countered calmly. "Emergency removal is permitted for misconduct." The vote went forward. One by one, hands rose. At first, it was hesitant, then more, a tide swelling against her. When Linda raised her hand, Janet's composure cracked. "Traitor," she spat. "You'll regret this." The final tally wasn't close. By majority, Janet was removed as president. The room erupted in cheers and jeers. Some clapped, some stormed out, others simply exhaled relief. Carl slumped in his chair, pale and defeated. Janet stood trembling, eyes darting like a trapped animal. For a moment, I thought she might physically lash out. Instead, she grabbed the gavel, hurled it across the room where it clattered against the wall, and stormed out. The silence she left behind was heavy. Everyone knew it wasn't over. Removal from office wouldn't quench her thirst for control. It would only deepen her grudge. That night, I checked the cameras twice, then 3 times. Every creak of the house felt louder. Every shadow along the tree line seemed to twitch. Janet had lost her title, her authority, her stage. That made her more dangerous than ever. I wasn't wrong. 2 nights later, the trail cam near the shoreline triggered. I checked the footage in the morning and froze. Headlights, a truck, backing down toward the lake with something large on a trailer. The timestamp read just past midnight. When the lights swung across the water, I saw it clearly. Another bulldozer. Janet hadn't given up on her dock dream. She'd simply gone rogue. And this time, without the HOA to restrain her, there was no telling how far she'd go. The footage looped over and over on my laptop, the grainy trail cam showing headlights bouncing down my driveway in the dead of night. Then the reveal. A flatbed trailer with a bulldozer strapped on, its yellow frame glinting in the glow. At the wheel of the truck was Janet herself. No contractor this time, no plausible deniability. Just one furious woman and a stolen plan. I stared at the timestamp. 12:47 in the morning. By the time I'd slept through it, she'd already tried to deliver her revenge. I hurried down to the lake to see the aftermath. The shoreline bore fresh scars. Deep tire tracks raked through the gravel, mud churned into swamps, saplings broken where the trailer had fishtailed. But the bulldozer wasn't there. For a moment, panic flared. Had she actually managed to build something? Then I saw it, out in the shallows, a hunched silhouette. The bulldozer sat half-submerged, tilted at a pathetic angle, its bucket jutting out of the water like a drowning hand reaching for rescue. Janet had tried to drive it straight into the muck, probably imagining she'd carve a foundation for her mythical dock. Instead, the lake had claimed another machine. I laughed, short and sharp. The absurdity was almost too much. She had gone rogue, risked everything, and ended up repeating the exact same humiliation. But this time, the consequences would be different. By morning, word had already spread. A jogger had seen the wreck at dawn and posted a photo online. By breakfast, the neighborhood was buzzing. By lunch, a local news van rolled into the subdivision. Bulldozer sinks in lakefront feud, the headline blared on the evening broadcast. Footage showed deputies inspecting the scene, the machine groaning as water lapped at its engine. Reporters interviewed neighbors on both sides, some laughing, some outraged, all united in disbelief. Janet became the spectacle, her name plastered across the screen as the face of suburban madness. That afternoon, the sheriff himself arrived with 2 deputies. I watched from my porch as they knocked on her door. She answered in a bathrobe, hair wild, eyes bloodshot. They spoke for several minutes, then led her to the cruiser. Not handcuffed, yet, but unmistakably under detention. The crowd gathered instantly. Phones recorded. Whispers flew. By the time the cruiser pulled away, Janet's downfall had gone viral across the county. But chaos doesn't end when the ringleader falls. It metastasizes. The HOA, now leaderless, fractured completely. Carl tried to step up, shouting at meetings that the dock plan must continue, that Janet was sacrificed for the cause. His words fell flat. Half the board wanted to distance themselves from the disaster entirely. The other half clung to the fantasy. Meetings devolved into shouting matches, some ending with chairs slammed against walls. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself turned toxic. Neighbors who once waved politely now hurled insults across yards. Cars were keyed. Mailboxes smashed. Someone poured bleach on a woman's flower beds because she'd voted against the dock. It was no longer about lake access. It was about sides, grudges, vengeance. I found myself in the crosshairs again. One morning, every tire on my truck was slashed. Another night, I woke to the smell of smoke. Someone had lit a trash fire on my lawn. It was quickly contained, but the message was clear. The war wasn't just Janet's anymore. It belonged to everyone she'd poisoned. And through it all, the bulldozer remained, half swallowed by the lake, an absurd monument to entitlement. The county brought in cranes to remove it, but the machine was so mired in muck that the effort stalled for weeks. Tourists actually drove out to see it, snapping photos like it was a roadside attraction. I considered leaving more than once, selling the property, moving somewhere quieter, somewhere sane. But every time I sat on the porch, watching the sunlight shimmer across the water, I remembered why I stayed. This lake wasn't just scenery. It was history. My grandfather had fished here, my father had taught me to swim here. To abandon it would be to surrender to people who saw land as nothing but leverage. So I stayed. And I plotted. Because while Janet had burned her credibility, Carl was still dangerous. He was quieter, sneakier. He stopped waving bylaws and started whispering behind closed doors, rallying the last of the loyalists. His new plan wasn't about bulldozers or spectacle. It was about legal warfare, drawn out and suffocating. I discovered his scheme when a thick envelope arrived one morning, this time from a new law firm. Inside, notice of intent to pursue adverse possession. The HOA was actually claiming they'd earned rights to my shoreline through long-standing community use. I nearly tore the letter in half. Long-standing community use? The only thing long-standing about their dock project was failure. But Carl had shifted the battlefield. He wasn't gambling on bulldozers anymore. He was gambling on attrition. That night, I drove past his house. Through the window, I saw him hunched over paperwork, phone pressed to his ear, stacks of files spread across the table. He wasn't the loudmouth anymore. He was the strategist, and that made him worse than Janet. Meanwhile, Janet herself resurfaced. Not in person, she'd gone quiet after her detention, but online. Anonymous accounts began posting on local forums, claiming I was the villain, that I'd manipulated the board, that I'd framed her. The writing style was distinct, her venom unmistakable. She wasn't gone. She was lurking, waiting for her chance to crawl back. The neighborhood spiraled deeper. Kids no longer played outside. Block parties evaporated. Every gathering felt like a cold war, eyes darting, conversations clipped. It wasn't a subdivision anymore. It was a battlefield with cul-de-sacs. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon, David stopped by again. He looked exhausted. "This can't go on," he said. "We're tearing ourselves apart. People are talking about dissolving the HOA altogether." I leaned back, considering. Dissolution would mean freedom. No more citations, no more petty tyrants. But it would also mean scorched earth. Friendships shattered. Property values rocked. Years of bitterness cemented. "Maybe that's what it takes," I said finally. "Maybe the only way to kill the beast is to burn it down." David sighed. "If we do, Carl won't go quietly. And Janet," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The next day, the bulldozer finally came out of the lake. It took 3 cranes, an army of workers, and half the county watching. As the machine creaked free from the muck, dripping and ruined, the crowd cheered. But the cheer wasn't joy. It was catharsis, a release of weeks of tension. Janet's monument was gone. But the wound remained. That night, a brick crashed through my front window. Wrapped around it was a note scrawled in jagged handwriting, "You haven't won." I picked it up, glass crunching under my boots, and read it twice. The handwriting wasn't Janet's. It was Carl's. The war had a new general now. And unlike Janet, he wasn't reckless. He was patient, which meant the worst was still ahead. The brick through my window had been Carl's declaration of war. Subtlety was gone. He wasn't the quiet strategist anymore. He was stepping into Janet's shoes, only colder and sharper. For weeks, I lived under siege. Letters from his lawyers arrived almost daily, each one thicker, each one more convoluted, each one accusing me of another sin, denying historic access, fomenting hostility, even intimidating board members. The irony dripped off the page. He wasn't writing legal arguments. He was bleeding me through paperwork. The neighborhood, already cracked, finally began to collapse. Drive down the street and you could see it. Houses divided like political factions. Some lawns displayed homemade signs supporting HOA justice. Others displayed countersigns demanding private property rights. It looked less like a suburb and more like a protest zone. The worst came when kids started fighting. One afternoon, I found 2 middle schoolers brawling near the lake, one shouting, "My dad says your dad's a thief," while the other screamed back about bulldozers. Parents dragged them apart, but the damage was clear. The poison had seeped into the next generation. Through all of it, Janet lurked. She'd vanished from public view, but online she was everywhere. Anonymous posts on Facebook groups, whisper campaigns on neighborhood forums. She spun elaborate stories about conspiracies, about how I had manipulated evidence to ruin her. Sometimes her words were echoed at board meetings by Carl himself, as though he and Janet had struck an unholy alliance. That's when it dawned on me they had. Janet had the fury, Carl had the patience. Together, they were stitching a final offensive, blending her recklessness with his calculation. I found proof one evening while checking the trail cams. The motion sensor had captured them. Janet and Carl together, standing near the lake at midnight, their faces pale in the infrared glow. They were pointing, gesturing furiously at the waterline, then shaking hands. Enemies turned co-conspirators. I printed the stills and set them on my kitchen counter. My pulse thumped as I stared at them. Whatever came next, it would be bigger than bulldozers, bigger than lawsuit. The answer came sooner than I expected. One Friday morning, heavy equipment arrived again, not sneaking down in the night, but openly, boldly, rolling into the cul-de-sac with engines growling. This time it wasn't just bulldozers. Dump trucks, cement mixers, piles of rebar. An entire construction operation, bigger than anything yet. The neighbors poured out of their homes, stunned. Carl marched at the head of the procession, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a foreman. Janet was beside him, triumphant, her face lit with manic energy. "We're building today," Carl shouted. "The dock begins now. We've secured permits." It was a lie, I knew instantly. No county in their right mind would have approved this after 2 sunken bulldozers and a viral news fiasco. But lies don't need truth. They just need momentum. The equipment roared to life. Cement mixers churned. Bulldozers rolled toward the lake. The air vibrated with defiance. I stepped into the road, blocking their path. "This ends here," I said. Carl sneered. "You've stalled long enough. The community won't be held hostage any longer." "Community?" I asked, sweeping my gaze across the crowd. Half the neighbors were already shouting at him, demanding proof of permits, warning him to stop. The other half stood frozen, too stunned to intervene. "You're destroying this neighborhood," I said flatly. "No," Carl snapped. "We're saving it." The bulldozer kept rolling. And then, in one of those surreal twists life sometimes delivers, the sky opened. A storm had been building all morning, thick clouds swirling, air heavy with tension. At that exact moment, the rain broke, sheets of water slamming down, turning the ground slick in seconds. The bulldozer hit the same siltous stretch Janet had cursed before. Its tracks spun, mud sprayed, the machine sliding sideways toward the lake. The driver tried to correct, but the rain had turned the bank into a slick chute. The bulldozer lurched forward, slammed nose first into the water, and began to sink. The crowd screamed. People scrambled backward. Another machine tried to pull it free, only to skid dangerously close to the edge itself. Carl shouted orders no one followed. Janet shrieked incoherently, her voice cracking under the downpour. The chaos was complete. I should have been satisfied. The lake had delivered its verdict yet again. But satisfaction never comes clean. As the bulldozer groaned and tilted, I saw something in the driver's face: panic. This wasn't his fight. He was just a worker caught in the madness. I waded into the rain, yelling for him to cut the engine. He scrambled out the cab window, leaping into the muck as the machine tilted further. The splash nearly knocked me back. Within minutes, the bulldozer was gone, swallowed entirely by the storm-fed water. The silence after was deafening, broken only by the hiss of rain. Everyone stood frozen, drenched, staring at the lake as if it had consumed not just steel, but the last shred of sanity in the neighborhood. Then the sirens came. Deputies, county officials, emergency vehicles. They swarmed the scene, voices barking over radios, hands gesturing wildly. The crowd parted as officers closed in on Carl and Janet. Carl tried to argue, waving his clipboard, shouting about permit. One deputy snatched the papers, flipped through them, and laughed. "These are fake." Janet screamed, tried to lunge at the officer, had to be restrained. The image of her thrashing in the rain, hair plastered, mud-streaked, was burned into me forever. They were both arrested on the spot. Charges of trespassing, reckless endangerment, falsification of document. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some simply collapsing into exhausted silence. And just like that, the war was over. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood limped toward recovery. The HOA board dissolved itself, unable to function under the wreckage. Without Janet and Carl, the loyalists scattered, embarrassed and defeated. Signs disappeared from lawns. People started talking again, tentative but hopeful. The county drained the lake to extract the sunken machinery. For months, the shoreline was a scarred construction zone, but eventually, the water returned, calmer, quieter, as though reclaiming its dignity. One evening, I sat on the porch, bourbon in hand, watching the sunset paint the lake gold. The silence felt heavier, deeper. Not the tense silence of conflict, but the kind that comes after a storm, when everything broken has been washed clean. David stopped by, leaning on the porch rail. "It's over," he said simply. "Yeah," I replied. "But look what it cost." He nodded. "Sometimes that's the price of peace. Sometimes you have to burn down the old to make room for the new." I looked out at the lake. The reflection shimmered, broken only by the faint ripple of fish rising. For all the chaos, all the madness, it had never been the enemy. It had always been the ally, patient and unyielding, swallowing whatever arrogance humans tried to force upon it. Janet and Carl thought they could control it, thought they could bend it to their will. But the lake doesn't compromise. It only waits. And now, at last, it was waiting quietly again. The neighborhood would heal, scars and all. But me? I'd never forget. Every ripple of that water would always remind me of the bulldozers, the lawsuits, the sabotage, the rain. And the lesson carved into the shoreline forever: entitlement sinks.